Good afternoon to Amsterdam, everyone out there in the audience, online. My name is Daniel, and today we're going to be talking about what you might think is boring stuff, like the regulations around building software in Europe. And you might think it's only relevant to European products, but as we'll find out through the discussion today, there's more than just European software at stake. Open source, no matter where it's made, if it's distributed in Europe, might be an issue. So we've got a lot to cover today. Originally, I just wanted to talk about the Cyber Resilience Act, CRA, but there's a number of other regulations that are going to be important to understand at least the scope, and if your product, open source organization, or even company are impacted. Before we do that, what you have to know about Europe, they love these acronyms. You cannot escape them, right? So next, because it's going to come up a couple times, I wanted to just go through some important terms. One of the ones you might have heard of before is Trilogue. It's the European version of dialogue, and it's composed of three groups. Parliament represents the people of Europe. The council represents the governments because, governments aren't the same as people. And the commission is actually the cabinet, the executive body in Europe. So the trilogue, what it does is it gets these groups together and they come to kind of an agreement, yeah, we can go along with this. That's what the trilogue does. After the trilogue phase, then regulations enter, well, depending on the type, and we'll talk about that in a second, they enter various phases of implementation. The next one to remember is the European single market. This will come up a lot. Basically what you have to imagine Europe as being is a border keeping everything out and everything in. Once something crosses that border, it enters the European single market. This is not value-added tax. It's not about taxation. That's different in every country. And it's complicated. It's not part of today's talk. When you've created an act or a directive, but generally acts are things that enter force. That means that the cabinet and everyone else has agreed upon this as being binding legislation. It's entered force, but Europe sort of lives in reality and expects you to have time to apply this kind of thing. So generally, it'll enter force and then a year, 2 years, sometimes even 3 years later, it'll actually be applied. And we'll see this throughout the course of the talk. Then you have acts versus directives. Acts are things that apply at the European level. Directives are policy that is expected to be implemented at the national level. So it will, ideally it's a copy paste. You give it to some lawyers and then the nation will put it into law. In practice, it's not quite that simple. Now we're getting into the meat. Commercial activity means you are selling a product, or a distributor is importing a product across that boundary and selling it in Europe. Then we've got a brand new term. I'll talk a lot about this later. Just remember, open source stewards are entities that do not create products for sale. They steward communities. Nonprofits, foundations are types of entities that could be considered stewards. Market surveillance is a practice that the regulator uses to make sure that people are actually, or companies and people, but mostly companies, are fulfilling their obligations according to the stipulations of the regulations. A word you might not know, ICT in Europe, that means basically IT, information and communication technology. This comes into place if your company uses, AWS. AWS is an ICT provider to your company. And then we have the fun ones, regulatory capture versus malicious compliance. Regulatory capture happens when a for-profit entity works so closely with the government that the government cannot escape its bounds. So in Europe, the Commission is very tightly connected to the Microsoft ecosystem. You could consider that the Commission is captured by Microsoft. I'm not saying that they are, but malicious compliance is very clear. Malicious compliance is an approach of complying with regulations in a way that ultimately harms the consumer, and that's why we have things like market surveillance, to make sure that the consumers, the users, the people, the most vulnerable are protected. So I want to go forward. There we go. We're going to start with Digital Markets Act. I've got a lot to go through. It starts being applied in about a week. It regulates the gatekeepers. There's 6 of them right now that are regulated: Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Microsoft, and Meta. And what it's trying to do is remove the power that these platforms have over the market such that other companies cannot do similar things. I mean, it's classical monopoly busting, and the act itself is pretty clear. And I think, if you do decide to look up these legislation pieces, you'll see that the regulators worked hard on the language, right? The regulation on contestable and fair markets in the digital sector. It's very clear. We've got a timeline. You can see before when I said enters force and in application. Right now, March, the deadline to comply, that is the application moment. I believe it's the 6th or 7th of March. And what does compliance mean? Well, each gatekeeper has a designation. For example, if we just talk about browsers, there's one missing here. It's the Edge browser. That's because Microsoft decided to work together with the Commission in advance of the decision in, what was that, in August, to say, yeah, okay, we're going to make Edge comply, right? And basically, this is about making platforms more accessible. And there's some news. You might have heard that to get a third-party app store onto the Apple iOS ecosystem, you must provide Apple with a €1 million bond, which isn't exactly in the nature of what the regulator was expecting when they were hoping that they would open up the market. The PWA is also no longer installable on iOS for any browser, even though you can install other browsers on the iOS. People are calling this malicious compliance. I won't, because I use an Apple device. I don't want them to take away my my logins, which they probably won't do, right? Microsoft just, I think last week, said, you know what, we're going to comply from the beginning. We don't need to go through this whole rigmarole of getting lawyers involved and fighting the battle about Edge, because we're going to lose it anyway. So they already decided that Edge is no longer going to be shipped by default in Europe. Again, this is all Europe, not the rest of the world. And I kind of think that's, reading the room from Microsoft. Google is going to give you more consent windows. Imagine having to give consent to accept the cookies. This is the kind of thing that we're kind of expecting. And again, like I was saying before, the market surveillance can flag malicious compliance and inform the regulatory bodies that things aren't going well. If you're a European, every European state, the place where you live, has a place where you can complain if you're not satisfied. Additionally, Japan is following this very closely and is expected to have a similar piece of legislation in the near future. I don't know if that's this year or next year, but it's going to happen in Japan as well. And if you've been following the news, there was recently this battle, this epic battle between Apple and Epic about payment gateways or gatekeeping in the US. So we can expect the US to start slowly marching along. Now, the Cyber Resilience Act is maybe the exciting one for us here. It hasn't yet been approved. The Trilogue did more or less agree, but based on the parliament votes and who's getting into office and not, it's going to be finally put into law in September, October. It's not going to not go into law. It will become legislation. And what it does do is it regulates commercial activity in software. It does regulate open source software, and it introduces the notion of software liability. We'll talk about the product liability directive in a second, but basically what it means is your software is a product. As a distributor of a product, you have obligations to the consumer. We'll talk about those in a second. And I'll let you just read that and move on. Again, entering into force sometime this year. And the way it's going to be introduced is in multiple stages. So there's about a dozen additional standards that need to be written and published over the next few years. But the first one that's important, after 20 months after it enters force, you're going to have to share cybersecurity incidents, not just 0 days that are known, but things that are actually being used in the wild on your company, on your product. You're going to have to report this to the regulator within 24 hours. And you're going to have 4 weeks to solve it. How this is going to happen, we're not sure yet, but that's the exciting part. 3 years from the introduction, or from the entry, they're going to introduce what's, the rest of the rules, which means you have to keep an SBOM on file for every release of your software, software bill of materials, for every release of your software for 5 years from the point in time when you introduce it to the market. There's discussion about how long software should be on the market, whether that's 5 years or 10 years, but you'll see it's probably going to be 5 for every release. You also have to maintain documentation for every release for 5 years. This is a product that you're putting on the market. Even if your company shutters, you have to provide a way to maintain that documentation and SBOM for those artifacts for 5 years. There's discussion amongst the community about open source software, and these are kind of like the bullet points that you have to remember. But the biggest thing that Europe is concerned about here is people putting dangerous software into digital products or products with digital elements. Is how they initially framed it, right? So if you have a medical device that has a user interface, that user interface is software, and that software is also part of what is being protected by this regulation, because we need to protect the most vulnerable, which are the humans in the room, right? The companies are the ones who are not the most vulnerable. They're the ones that are taking advantage. Again, leveling the playing field means making it better for people. And can you see this? This is a great spreadsheet. This is actually directly from Benjamin, who worked on writing the Cyber Resilience Act. Because if you are creating open source software, what kind of creation is it? Are you giving it away for free, or are you selling it? That's kind of the big distinction, right? If you're the Linux Foundation, well, you are very likely an open source software steward, because you're making it available to a broader community. You're not directly taking profit from it. But if you are a company that open sources a library and builds a product on top of that library, you directly make money from that library, you're a manufacturer. And manufacturers have all of these obligations. You have to protect the consumer. Now, an exciting thing from my perspective is this, the CE marking. You've probably seen it on your device. I don't see one here, so I quit. No, but the CE marking shows that you can have faith in the company, that the company has done everything that they're supposed to do to protect you as a consumer, that your phone isn't going to start on fire in your pocket, that your watch is not going to interfere with the radio, right? There's these things that your software has to comply with, your products have to comply with. And as a steward, you cannot claim this because you're not putting a product onto the market. Why would you want this on your product? Well, you don't have a choice. You must fulfill the requirements to put the SE on your software product. How do you know what a product is something that the Blue Book has told us for almost 40 years. I'll share the link to the Blue Book later, but basically the Blue Book in Europe talks about what a product is, who has liability, who is responsible for the manufacturing, for the customer, for the supply chain, right? That's all in the Blue Book. And the Blue Book is due to be updated again when the Product Liability Directive, in concert with the Cyber Resilience Act, enters force. I've got a link at the end. You can take a picture and follow the stuff later. But basically, what it's trying to do is provide a mechanism by which the consumer can be protected. The regulator has even said that we do have product liability today. If you get hurt by a piece of software, you can sue, but it's not enshrined in law. And he's also clear, in 20 years, there's been like less than a dozen major product liability cases in Europe. So this is more of a preventative act, and it does bring a little touch of irony too, and that is that, you know, we were talking about the malicious compliance of Apple earlier. If the Product Liability Directive had already been here, then they would understand that they can offload their liability and their risk to the developers of the applications and app stores that are putting them on their devices. They no longer have to worry about that. They probably still do, which is why we're seeing it as malicious compliance. And now I'm wondering to myself, is it still malicious compliance? Maybe they just have to protect themselves. The Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA, I want you to remember this image, not Dora the Explorer, DORA the dragon who is going to destroy your financial company. DORA is a monster. Basically, this is all about the risk management for the financial industry, and it doesn't just touch the banks, it doesn't touch your money lenders or your crowdfunding platforms. It does touch all of those. It also influences the buying decisions of who you work with. Like I was saying before, if AWS is your ICT service provider and you're in the banking industry, suddenly the leadership of AWS can be liable for attacks on your products that they were involved in. Furthermore, it's happening really soon, right? Like, look at that. 17th of July is when they're going to finalize what you have to do, and in January of 2025, it's entering force. That gives you 6 months to change all of your contracts, and if your company is involved in the banking industry, leave the conference right now, get on the call with your lawyers and figure it out. I'm not kidding. This is the scariest one of all of them because, like, I think Europe woke up and is like, oh yeah, you know, bad stuff doesn't just happen with cryptocurrency, it's also classical banking. We have to protect people from this stuff because, you know, what's going to happen is people are going to spin up a shell, they're going to sell the IP, they're going to move to the other shell, and no one's responsible anymore. They're just wiping their hands of stuff, and Europe is not going to let that happen. To the point that they will even go into your books as an ICT provider and make sure that everything is okay. And by books, I mean everything. Maybe Dora the Explorer is the right name for this, after all. So they're going to explore you. We're going to calm down a little bit. I'm almost running out of time. The Digital Services Act is already in application. Welcome to the new GDPR. What the DSA is trying to do is adapt what we learned from the GDPR program of protecting people's personally identifiable information and turning it into safety with a very large focus on children's rights and protecting them from corporations, from people stealing their identity, from harvesting their information, and gives us as consumers a way to communicate with these people, these companies, I mean, to communicate with them either directly or with legal battles, getting compensation for things that are done without your consent. the Digital Services Act is important, and it might not apply to you if you're a small company, but if you're involved in platforms, if you would disseminate information across the European border to Europeans, this does apply to you. And I think I'm just going to read it. The salient part of this process in Europe is that the regulations are all tightly coupled, and just because it's written doesn't mean it won't be revised. As industry starts to find loopholes and ways around it, those will be closed over time, and new regulations will be built as new industries arise. If you want to take a picture, there's all the links. I couldn't make them any bigger. Too many QR codes didn't work. I'll leave that up for a second. And maybe it's too much. If it is, I'm happy to talk to you. You can hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm around today, tomorrow, and also online. I love talking to people, finding out what ticks, and I think I finished a couple minutes early. I know I don't have any questions, but I do have kind of like a hopeful comment. I know I scared you a little bit with DORA, and you might be afraid of DSA. You might think that the regulations around the Cyber Resilience Act make it hard to be involved in open source. And I think that if you're just getting this pressed onto you, that is potentially the case, but you can get involved. And you know, like I was saying before, every European country has access points to meet the regulators. There are workshops. There's always expert advice being sought after, and early drafts of the Cyber Resilience Act, because what they did through their engagement and their involvement and their community management is they helped the regulator understand what open source is, because they don't. And I think that by being involved and by learning more about it, it's an important way for us to exercise our participation in the world we want to build. So with that, I'll give up the stage, and thank you very much. Ciao.